He did not remember how the journey began, only that his feet had been moving long before his thoughts could catch up. The landscape had been shifting quietly, trading its familiar markers for something less defined. Trees that bent toward one another, as if sharing secrets he was not meant to hear. Stones with shadows longer than their shapes. A sky that refused to pick a time of day. The air was not heavy, but it pressed close, as though trying to fold him into something older than weather. He walked not with purpose, but with rhythm, the way leaves drift downstream not because they must, but because they are no longer held. Then, without warning, the bridge appeared. Not ahead, not behind, but simply there, as if it had always been waiting in a place outside direction. It did not rest on pillars or span any body of water. It began in the middle of land that looked untouched and ended in land that looked forgotten. It did not arch, did not stretch. It hovered gently above the ground, like a memory that hadn't settled on when it happened. He stepped onto it without hesitation, though he felt none of the weight leave his body. The surface was neither warm nor cold, and it made no sound beneath him. It was not made of wood or stone or any substance he could name, but it held, firm and yielding, like the palm of someone who knows you, but will not ask questions. As he walked, the world behind him began to still, not in silence, but in memory. The rustle of leaves became the hush of parchment. The distant bird call thinned into something like a lullaby no longer sung. He was not alone, yet saw no one. The bridge did not lead him forward. It unspooled around him, turning not left or right, but inward, until direction itself no longer mattered. Time shifted slightly with each step, not rushing past, but softening, as if it too had grown tired of being measured. He thought once of stopping, of turning around to see where he had come from, but the thought itself dissolved like breath on glass. Behind him, the air closed without trace. Before him, the path kept no promises, only invitation. The sky dimmed, not with dusk, but with depth, as though the farther he walked, the more light had to remember where it came from. There was no fear, only the quiet certainty that something had been waiting, not for him in particular, but for someone who would understand that not all crossings are meant to arrive. The air along the bridge changed as he continued, not with temperature, but with density, like the difference between hearing and remembering a sound. There was no wind, yet something brushed past him from time to time, a breeze made not of motion, but of impressions, moments caught in the space between knowing and forgetting. The further he walked, the more the surroundings lost their need to resemble anything familiar. The colors faded not into darkness, but into recollection, pale and warm, like stories that had been told too often and had settled into silence. Shapes became gestures, edges became intentions. The bridge did not lengthen, yet he felt no closer to its end. Distance here was not measured in steps, but in layers, each one thinner, quieter, more reluctant to remain. His breath slowed, not out of fatigue, but in mimicry, as if time itself had taught him how to breathe in its rhythm. He did not hurry. The bridge would not allow it. Speed belonged to places where outcomes mattered. Beneath his feet, the surface seemed to ripple with memory, though it remained firm. Each plank was a pause, each step a thought recalled but not spoken. He imagined, though he didn't know why, that others had crossed this bridge before him. He could feel their presence, not in the air, but in the absence of doubt. The bridge held not the weight of their bodies, but of their decisions, pressed gently into its surface like the soft impressions left by pages closed too long. He sensed moments embedded in the grain, not moments he had lived, but ones that resonated in his chest as if they might have been his. A goodbye whispered too late. A door that should have remained open. A glance that tried to stay. These were not regrets. They were threads, and the bridge had gathered them all, weaving them into something that could be crossed only by walking through what had never quite been resolved. Above him, the sky no longer held form. It did not stretch or dim. It simply receded like a curtain pulled back to reveal the space behind forgetting. The bridge curved slightly now, not toward any visible point, but into something that felt round, encompassing, as if he were moving not forward but inward, into the architecture of a memory being reassembled. His shadow no longer followed. It had thinned until it barely touched the surface, then faded altogether. He did not miss it. He had not come here to be seen. He had come to remember what he never knew he had left behind. He began to notice that time no longer moved beside him, but beneath him, folded in thin, translucent layers like dried petals pressed between pages of a book never opened again. Each step uncovered not a new piece of ground, but a sliver of something that had been waiting quietly, perhaps for centuries, perhaps only since morning. There were no markers, no carvings, no signs, yet the bridge was full of messages. Not written, not spoken, but felt. The silence itself became a kind of language, not empty, but patient, as if it had chosen not to interrupt him. He thought about the way time usually behaved, how it pulled, demanded, pushed people forward without asking if they were ready. But here, nothing pushed. The bridge had no urgency, and in that absence of pressure, he discovered the weight he had been carrying in all other places. It was not in his back or shoulders, but in the corners of his mind, where unfinished hours and unlived days had gathered like dust. The bridge offered no broom to sweep them away. It simply gave them room to breathe. To his left, there was no horizon, only soft brightness, like memory remembering itself. To his right, something darker lingered, not threatening, but distant, like the part of a dream that fades first. He did not feel watched, but he felt acknowledged. It was as though the bridge did not need to observe him to know he was there. It had known the idea of him long before he had arrived. Each pace was now accompanied by a flicker of sensation, not quite a memory, not quite a vision. A hand released too early, a letter unsent, the warmth of someone who had stood nearby too briefly. He realized these were not his alone. The bridge held pieces of many people, braided gently through the floor beneath him, not to burden, but to remember. Every path walked across this bridge had left something behind. Not footprints, but fragments of longing too quiet to voice aloud. He added his own without knowing it, a silent offering in the form of an unfinished question. Above him the sky deepened, not in color, but in silence, becoming vast enough to hold everything unsaid. The air thinned without discomfort, as though making room. There was no chill, but the warmth felt like it had come from inside his chest, as though something within him had begun to recall its own shape. The bridge did not change pace, nor did it ask anything of him. And in that gentle indifference he felt, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to exist without being measured. As he walked further, a subtle hum began to grow, not in the ears, but in the bones. A quiet resonance that reminded him of the feeling one gets when standing near something sacred without being told it is so. It was the kind of vibration that did not make noise, but softened all other sounds around it, like a low, ancient chord played beneath the surface of perception. He did not know where it came from, perhaps from the bridge, or perhaps from himself, but he welcomed it, as one welcomes a scent from childhood without needing to name it. There was no music, but there was rhythm, and it matched his steps in the way breath matches rest. The further he moved, the more the bridge seemed to carry him, not like a conveyor or wind, but with the softness of memory guiding action without needing words. He realized that he was no longer walking on something. It was as if he was moving within it, like a river carved from quiet time, flowing not forward but toward understanding, toward. He began to lose his awareness of distance. Whether he had walked for minutes or years no longer mattered. His legs did not tire. His mind did not wander. Everything had slowed without stopping. The bridge, too, seemed to stretch without extending. It curved only slightly, just enough to suggest that it would never truly reveal what lay ahead. And yet, he felt no need to see the end. There was peace in not knowing, in allowing the journey to hold its shape without interruption. He thought briefly of clocks, how much noise they make in rooms where silence tries to grow. Here, there were no clocks, no ticks, no reminders of what ought to come next. Just breath and footsteps, and something beneath it all humming like the root of an old lullaby. The edge of the bridge began to glow faintly, not with light, but with clarity, as though everything that had once been uncertain was beginning to take form. Not answers, but presence. Not revelation, but stillness. And in that stillness, he felt something loosen inside him. Not break, not tear, just release. He did not know what had left him, only that it had been with him long enough to shape how he walked. Now he walked as one who was no longer being followed by his own absence. The bridge had not changed. He had. He noticed, somewhere between thought and step, that the bridge no longer held to any landscape. The world around him had softened into suggestion, colors dissolving into the edges of recollection. There was no longer land to one side or sky above, only gradients of memory shaped like space. It did not frighten him. It felt like standing inside a story that had forgotten its ending, and in doing so, had finally become free. He did not question what would happen if he stopped. He would not fall. There was no gravity here, not in the traditional sense. The only thing that pulled was memory, and even that had grown gentle, no longer dragging but hovering, waiting to be noticed without insistence. The bridge existed not in defiance of time, but in cooperation with it, like a long breath between two thoughts. His body felt lighter now, not weightless, but unburdened, like clothes after a long day removed in silence. He could no longer feel the full outline of his form, yet he had never felt more present. There were no reflections to confirm he was still visible, no shadows to follow him, but his presence did not require proof. It was enough to be aware. The bridge had taught him this, not with lessons, but with patience. Some knowledge arrives not through revelation, but through waiting beside silence until it grows familiar. He understood now why the bridge had no destination. It had never been built to carry people toward something. It had been built to carry them through. Each step had become less of a motion and more of a becoming. He was not moving forward. He was unfolding like a letter that had been sealed before the ink was dry. The hum beneath him continued, deeper now, richer, like a pulse that had outlived its body, but refused to leave the world. In that hum was recognition, not of a person, but of a feeling, long misplaced. He could almost recall the moment he first forgot it, though he had no memory of when that was. He didn't need to. Some things return not with explanation, but with welcome, and so he welcomed it. The bridge curved once more, not visibly, but in spirit, and he followed it, not because he had to, but because he was now part of it. He had become the story it was carrying, and the story did not end. Not yet. Not here. There were still pages to be turned, even if they were blank. Especially if they were blank. It came gradually, the thinning of all things, the air, the space, the distinction between what was bridge and what was memory. Everything began to dissolve into suggestion, into softness. His footsteps left no echo now, not because they were too light, but because the place beneath him no longer needed to respond. He realized this was the final span, not of distance, but of meaning. The bridge had not changed, but its intention had completed something. It had opened itself just enough for him to pass through what had remained unopened in him. And now it was slowly closing, not behind him, not before him, but within him. There was no sadness, only something close to grace. He did not stop walking, though he felt stillness in his bones. Not paralysis, but peace. Not silence, but rest. His body, whatever that word now meant, had taken on the shape of the journey. He was no longer traveler or witness. He was what was being traveled, what was being remembered. He could feel everything he had left behind and everything he had not yet lived, coexisting now like breath in twin lungs. There was no conflict, no choice to be made, just a single line, drawn gently across the unknown, and he was walking it, neither arriving nor leaving, but becoming. The end of the bridge was not a place. It was a moment, and when he reached it, there was no door, no gate, no light, only pause. The kind of pause that happens before someone calls your name. not because they have something to say, but because the silence was ready to be spoken. He stood in that pause, not waiting, not bracing, just present. The hum faded, the air settled, the memory uncurled. And in that stillness, the bridge became what it had always been. Not a path, but a remembering. Not a structure, but a return. And so he did not step off. He did not look back. He did not need to. The bridge would always be where it was, between the moment he forgot and the one he just now recalled, between what he once was and what he was always becoming. There was no sensation of having crossed anything, and yet everything around him felt changed. The air no longer pressed inward. It expanded, slow and vast, as if welcoming him into a space that had been held in waiting. There was ground beneath him, though it did not resemble the land he had known before the bridge. It was not a return, not a new place. It was continuity, as though the journey had never been about leaving or arriving, but about moving deeper into something that had always been underneath. The sky no longer had a single hue. It was layered now, streaked with forgotten dawns and evenings that had not yet come. There were no stars, no clouds, only light, stretched thin and soft as though time had been dissolved and stirred gently into the atmosphere. He did not question how he had come here. The bridge was no longer visible behind him, but he could feel its trace within his step, like a rhythm still echoing in the chest after the music has ended. The terrain ahead was subtle in shape, but heavy with suggestion. Mounds of earth that curved like thoughts mid-formed. Pools of stillness that might once have been water, or memory, or silence held so long it had taken form. He walked without effort, not gliding, but no longer carrying himself in the way the body usually demands. His presence here did not require force. It simply was. Shadows moved differently now, not beside him, but ahead of him, as though guiding rather than following. They were not his own. They belonged to something else, perhaps the echoes of others who had passed through this place, or perhaps possibilities never chosen. He did not fear them. They did not behave like warnings. They moved slowly, gently, as if aware that he could see them for what they were, reminders that not all paths are straight, and not all versions of ourselves are left behind. Some stay near just close enough to whisper. The land curved subtly, and with it, the air began to hum once more, not from beneath, but from within. It was not sound, not vibration, just a quiet fullness that settled into his breathing. Every few steps, he would notice a shift, a stone that had not been there before, a bend in the slope that mirrored a memory he could not place. The world here was not built of space, but of timing. Everything appeared not where it belonged, but when, and so he stopped trying to map it. Direction had no power in a place like this. Only attention did. Where he looked, things opened. Where he lingered, things stayed. He began to understand that he was not being shown a new place. He was being remembered by it. He reached a clearing, though no trees had parted. It was not a space defined by absence, but by pause, as if the land had exhaled and left a quiet imprint in its breath. The ground here was softer, not with moss or soil, but with meaning, like a page that had been written on, erased, and then touched so often that its surface had become memory itself. In the center stood something that was not a structure, but resembled the shape of intention, rising slightly from the earth with the form of a question never asked aloud. It did not beckon, but it waited. He did not approach with caution. He simply moved toward it in the way a river returns to low ground. Inevitably, slowly, without needing to know why. As he neared it, the hum within him grew quieter, not because it had stopped, but because something else had begun to speak beneath it. It was not a voice. It was not a message. It was a feeling, familiar, unfinished, and gently sorrowful, like the last few words of a letter never sent. Around the shape, the air bent differently. Light softened into folds, shadows narrowed into lines, and distance compressed into a single point that seemed to hold more than space should allow. He circled it, not to study, but to listen. And though there was nothing to hear, he understood that this place had held many arrivals, none of them loud, none of them final. Footsteps that had never touched earth seemed to echo faintly around the clearing, not in sound, but in presence. He could feel the weight of those who had stood here before him, not as individuals, but as decisions, not people, but moments of becoming. He did not compare himself to them. He did not feel like one in a line. It was not a lineage. It was a constellation, each arrival separate, but held in the same sky. He sat, without choosing to. The earth welcomed him without adjustment. Time slowed further, folding itself under his spine, pressing gently against the spaces between memory and motion. He could not recall ever resting before this. Not truly. Not in the way that allows stillness to reach beyond the body. Here, he was not waiting. He was not recovering. He was simply paused, held in the soft grip of something older than need. The shape before him shimmered briefly, not with light, but with recognition, as if acknowledging the quietness he had brought with him. He did not bow. He did not speak. There was no need. The clearing was not asking anything of him. It was only showing him what it looked like when time at last stopped expecting answers. He rose not from impulse, but from something gentler, a movement born of listening rather than deciding. The shape in the center of the clearing did not react to his motion, yet he felt its awareness recede, as though it had completed the act of being seen. Around him, the landscape did not shift, but his place within it began to feel lighter, less defined. He walked again, though not with direction. The path beneath him formed with each step, not before it. He had become part of the terrain's memory, and in return, it shaped itself gently around him. The earth did not press back. The air did not stir. Even his breath seemed to find a new pattern, one that matched the pace of roots growing in darkness, slow and unseen but certain. He passed places that were not quite objects, outlines of ideas, half-shaped echoes of things once felt. A staircase that didn't lead up, but downward into stillness. A doorway carved from shadow, offering no promise of entry. A fence with no posts, just space where boundaries had once been imagined. Each fragment stood not as artifact, but as residue, things that once held meaning and had now softened into suggestion. He did not pause at them, for they did not ask to be interpreted. They had been left here not to explain, but to be remembered. Some held warmth, others chill, but none held threat. This was not a place of testing. It was a place of release. At the edge of something that may have once been a hill, he stopped again, not because he chose to, but because the landscape itself paused. There was no descent, no climb, just openness, expanding like breath after weeping. Before him stretched not a view, but a hush, vast and uncolored, the kind of space where even memory lowers its voice. He stood there long enough for the feeling to settle, the sensation of having nothing more to carry, not from having finished, but from no longer needing to. His hands relaxed, though he had not noticed they'd been clenched. His jaw loosened, his gaze softened. There was no longer anything to brace against. Even the shape of thought changed here. Instead of reaching forward, it curled inward like a ribbon folding into its own quiet curve. He stepped into the openness, not as one entering a new space, but as one becoming part of a silence already in progress. The ground felt softer, as if made of something more thoughtful than soil. With each footfall, the air adjusted slightly, not in temperature but in texture, like the way fabric shifts when touched with care. He realized the landscape was no longer separate from him. It did not surround him, it accompanied him. With every breath, he shaped it, and with every pause, it answered, not with form, but with tone. The world had become a conversation without words, and he had begun to listen not with his ears, but with his being. He moved slowly, not out of caution, but out of respect, the way one walks through a memory that hasn't fully settled. There were impressions here, not visual but emotional, like faint warmth left on a pillow, or the distant echo of someone standing nearby a moment too long. He passed through a grove of nothing, and yet felt its presence. Rows of almost trees, shadows with no sources, aligned just enough to suggest intentionality. He could feel stories here, not ones he knew, but ones that brushed the edge of recognition, like dreams half remembered in the early light of morning. He did not try to catch them. They were not meant to be held. Further ahead, the air became thinner again, not from height, but from release, as if something within the world was sighing. He felt lighter, not in body, but in need. There was no longer anything to seek. The absence of questions became a kind of answer. He walked now not to find, but to remain. To remain within this gentle unfolding of time that did not insist, did not chase, did not compare. The space around him no longer reacted. It received. It received him as one receives a returning thought. Not with fanfare, but with familiarity. He had become part of what waited here, not as visitor or intruder, but as someone the silence had once known and chosen not to forget. A faint shimmer began to gather in the air, not of light, but of suggestion, like the way air bends above warm stone, or the flicker of memory behind closed eyes. It hovered just ahead, changing with every blink, never quite settling into shape. He approached not with the desire to see, but with the patience to be near. The closer he came, the more he realized it was not a thing, but a moment, condensed, layered, waiting. It pulsed gently, not as a warning, but as a welcome, the way a heart might recognize something before the mind does. He stopped within reach of it, not touching, not turning away. And in that nearness, the shimmer folded open. What revealed itself was not a vision, but a feeling given form. It held no images, no figures, yet conveyed the full weight of something he had once known. An afternoon that had never been lived, a conversation that had almost happened, a kindness he had never received but had always believed possible. It was not nostalgia. It was not grief. It was potential, wrapped in stillness, and offered not as reward, but as reminder. He stood within it as one might stand in soft rain, not seeking shelter, not needing to understand where it came from, just present, just open, just gently changed. The shimmer began to dim, not because it faded, but because it had been seen. And things that have been seen fully no longer need to shine. He watched as it dissolved into the air around him, not disappearing, but dispersing, becoming part of the space again, like breath rejoining atmosphere. He remained still long after, not to hold on to the moment, but to honor the space it had become. His body felt softer now, not weaker, just quieter. As if it too had been holding light it didn't know how to release until now. The journey had not paused, it had only deepened. And within that deepening, he began to feel not the passing of time, but its embrace. He walked once more, but the world no longer felt external. Everything, sky, breath, soil, light, had become variations of the same thing, awareness. His steps did not land on ground. They landed within moments, each one unfolding like the slow bloom of a thought no longer afraid of being forgotten. There were no landmarks, and yet every place felt familiar, not from memory, but from resonance, the kind that stirs something ancient beneath the skin. He could no longer tell whether he was moving forward or simply being reassembled by the passage of stillness. There was no resistance, only release. The air ahead thickened slightly, as if preparing for something. Not danger, not ending, but presence. He sensed it before he saw it, a quiet gathering, not of figures, but of meaning. The space began to fold inward gently, respectfully, like a room preparing itself for company. And there, in the very heart of this soft convergence, stood nothing. Nothing solid, nothing shaped. Just a stillness that had learned how to wait. He stepped into it, not to cross, but to be held. The world dimmed without darkening. The air cooled without withdrawing. He felt for the first time fully seen, not by eyes, but by the absence of needing to be seen. He closed his own eyes, not out of fatigue, but reverence. Everything he had carried was now behind him, not lost, but no longer needed. The bridge had changed him, not by showing, but by staying. And this place, this moment, had finished the change by not asking him to become anything more. He stood there, timeless, not suspended, but complete, no longer reaching, no longer recalling, just part of the stillness that had shaped the bridge, shaped the world, shaped the quiet truth that time was never about movement but about return. He did not know how long he had remained in the stillness, nor did he need to. Duration no longer wrapped itself around experience the way it once had. Here, time didn't move forward. It rested, quietly, beside him. When he opened his eyes again, the world had not changed, but his place within it had deepened. The air greeted him with the same soft hush as before, and the ground below his feet welcomed him not as a traveler returning to a road, but as a silence returning to breath. He walked without intent, without wondering what lay ahead. It was not the future he was entering, but a rhythm, one that had waited patiently for him to be quiet enough to hear it. The path did not announce itself. It whispered with shape alone, guiding him with the barest curve in the horizon, like a melody remembered by muscle, not mind. He came upon what might have been a structure once, though time had softened it into suggestion. Low walls barely taller than his knee marked a square space, filled with nothing but light filtered in fragments, golden, warm, and moving, as if stirred by dreams. He stepped inside, not as one enters a room, but as one returns to a thought that had paused mid-sentence. The space held him gently, neither echoing nor reflecting, but absorbing his presence like a stone takes on sunlight. He felt no purpose in standing there, and yet he did not move. His stillness became part of the room's shape. He closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to listen, not for sound, but for alignment. What met him was not a message. It was a soft, unfolding sensation. The recognition that everything he had ever hoped to understand had never required understanding, only nearness. When he stepped out again, the light did not follow. It stayed within the shape, continuing its slow pulse across walls that no longer held anything. He did not look back. The past no longer had to be seen to be felt. The path resumed, not beneath him, but within him. And he followed it not with direction but with resonance. The wind returned in fragments, like notes of a lullaby no longer fully remembered, brushing past him in a pattern that felt more like breath than weather. All around him, the world expanded and thinned at once, becoming less about shape and more about tone, as if he were walking through the underside of a forgotten chord. And within that chord, he found the quiet certainty that nothing ahead would ask him to be anything other than what he already was. The land began to rise without gradient, a soft incline that felt more like suggestion than terrain. His body responded not with effort, but with acceptance, as though ascent was no longer something the legs negotiated, but something the breath agreed to. The higher he moved, the more the ground behind him seemed to drift away, not receding in distance, but in weight. It was not that he was forgetting. It was that what had been carried no longer needed to be held. The space around him grew quieter still, until even the thought of thought began to blur at its edges. The air did not thin. It expanded inward, like a room that had always been larger than it looked. He began to feel that he was being lifted not by motion, but by permission, the kind that comes when all resistance has finally softened into listening. At the crest of the rise there was no view. Instead, there was a stillness that seemed to hold every view that had ever been seen, like a gallery made entirely of the moments just before recognition. He stood at its center, not seeking anything, only present. The silence here was different from the silence before. It had a temperature, a pulse, the faint trace of something deeply understood, yet never spoken aloud. He closed his eyes again, and when he did, the world did not disappear. It layered itself gently across the inside of his awareness, the color of mornings he never remembered waking into, the warmth of hands he had never held but had somehow missed, the echo of footsteps that might have been his in another life. They did not flood him. They folded into him, as if returning to a shape that had long awaited their arrival. When he opened his eyes, nothing had changed, and yet he felt different. Not fuller, not emptier, but more aligned, as though the pieces of him that had scattered across time were no longer being asked to find each other. They simply were, whole not through collection, but through release. He began walking again, though he did not feel the ground beneath his feet. Movement had become relational, not spatial, each step a soft response to something unseen. Ahead, there was no structure, no object, no shift in terrain, and yet something awaited, not as a destination, but as a meeting point. He felt it the way one feels weather in the bones or memory in the chest, and it called to him without sound, without demand, only presence. He did not follow it. He joined it. The horizon curved gently inward, not like the rim of a bowl, but like the bending of memory around something it refused to forget. There was no sky above him now, only a ceiling of shifting gradients, like mist that had decided to become thought. He continued moving, though his body felt less like a body and more like a vessel for sensation, a moving pause through which the landscape could pass. The ground no longer crunched or softened. It simply responded, giving back exactly what he offered it. Nothing more, nothing less. In that reciprocity, he felt a quiet balance he had never known in places where motion came with measurement. Here, motion was communion. He was not crossing land, he was becoming part of its unfolding. He passed through a corridor made of nothing but temperature, cool on one side, warm on the other, where the only walls were moments from the past brushing against moments from the future. They did not clash. They did not try to explain themselves. They simply moved beside each other like two people who had once shared something and no longer needed to speak of it. In the center of this space was a single ripple in the air, like a question breathed but never asked. He walked through it without flinching. It passed over him like a curtain of water that didn't wet the skin, leaving behind the faint sensation of having remembered something important without knowing what it was. When the corridor opened, there was no threshold. He simply emerged into a clearing that had not been waiting but was nonetheless prepared. Its center held no object, no symbol, just stillness. So complete, so intact, it felt like standing within the idea of peace rather than peace itself. He stood there for a long while, not moving, not thinking, simply allowing the moment to be what it was. Around him, nothing stirred. Even time seemed to take a breath and then forget to exhale. And in that breathless quiet, he realized that the bridge had not ended when he thought it had. It had continued beneath all of this, not as a structure, but as a rhythm, a thread of presence running through everything, still holding him gently, invisibly, like the final note of a song that refused to fade. He remained in the clearing until the edges of things began to soften once more, not dissolve, not vanish, but recede into a deeper kind of stillness. It was not disappearance he felt, but absorption, as though the landscape had grown tired of being seen and had returned to the quiet satisfaction of simply being. He took a step, not forward, but inward. The world adjusted with him, folding into his pace. Light followed, not from above or behind, but from somewhere within, casting no shadow, illuminating nothing. It was not light to see by. It was light to be seen through. And as it filtered outward, he felt layers within himself begin to loosen. Expectations, definitions, even the quiet outlines of his name. They did not fall away. They simply became unnecessary. He walked again, but distance no longer offered change. Each place he passed through echoed the last, not in sameness, but in intimacy, like variations on a single note played by different hands. The land here was not unfamiliar, it was unbound. There were no features, no markers, just suggestions of space where presence could linger without explanation. He began to understand that nothing here was hidden. Things remained unseen only because they had no need to be observed. They existed in trust, not secrecy, and in walking among them, he was not discovering. He was being permitted. At the far edge of the clearing, or perhaps its center, for space had ceased to declare its boundaries, he came to a slope that was neither incline nor decline. It existed as a change in feeling rather than form. He followed it down, or perhaps into, and found himself surrounded by something almost like a room, though its walls were made of warmth and its corners of memory. In the middle of this soft enclosure stood no altar, no figure, no light, only a calm that had learned to stand still. He did not kneel, did not bow, but he recognized something here. It was not who he had been, nor who he was. It was simply the part of him that had never asked to be named, and had waited all this time for nothing more than to be felt. The moment lengthened, not in time but in depth. He stood at the edge of something vast, though it did not stretch outward. It expanded downward, like a feeling one descends into slowly, fully aware that it will not let them return the same. There was no fear in him, only a kind of sacred hesitation, the kind that lives in the space before a confession, when words haven't yet found shape, but the soul has already opened. He did not step forward. He allowed himself to be drawn. Like water pulled toward gravity, it had always known. The descent was not physical. He moved through layers of self, each one softer than the last, until he arrived at the part of him that no longer asked questions. There, in that stillest depth, the world stopped arranging itself into things. There was no floor, no ceiling, no direction, only presence. It held him, not tightly, but wholly. He felt not embraced, but known. And in being known, he ceased needing to define. All that he had been, his fears, his small longings, even the quiet griefs he never spoke aloud, settled around him, not to be judged, but to be witnessed. They formed no pattern, offered no conclusion. They simply glowed with the honesty of having been carried. And now, finally, they were being allowed to rest. He remained in that space for what could not be measured, until something inside him, something older than breath, stirred. It did not urge him to leave. It simply opened, like a gate unlatched from within. He rose again, though he had never fallen. The world began to gather shape once more, slowly, cautiously, like light creeping back into a room where someone is waking. He felt no urgency to move, but movement began nonetheless. Not by force, but by agreement. He was being lifted by something that had waited until he was ready to rise. And as he ascended, not toward a new place, but into a more spacious version of the same one, he brought nothing with him, nothing but the memory of having been seen without needing to explain. The space around him grew brighter, not with color, but with invitation. It was not a place anymore. It had become a threshold, one without edges, one that did not divide, but reminded. He stepped into it without hesitation, and immediately everything softened. Time no longer unfolded, it exhaled. The path beneath him had become a current, guiding gently, without direction. He was not walking now. He was participating in motion, a quiet surrender that did not ask him to let go, but to remember what it felt like never to have held on. He did not miss the bridge. He realized he had never left it. Around him, a new kind of silence emerged, not the absence of sound, but the presence of everything that no longer needed to be said. It was dense, but not heavy, full, but not crowded. He felt himself dissolving into it, not losing, but rejoining. The form he had worn all this way began to blur, not in outline, but in significance. And yet he felt no fading, only expansion, as if he were becoming less visible, but more real. There was no resistance. Even memory now moved like breath, rising and falling without needing to be held. At the very heart of this threshold, he paused, not because anything blocked him, but because stillness had returned, and it asked to be met one last time. He stood there as presence, as echo, as arrival. No thoughts came, no visions opened, only a warmth, steady and quiet, that began in his chest and expanded until it met the edge of the silence. And there, where silence met warmth, something clicked into place. Not an ending, not a beginning, just a knowing. The bridge had brought him here, not to change, not to heal, but to become part of what had always waited, the place between becoming and being, between time and presence, where the self is not forgotten, but finally allowed to rest. He emerged into a space that did not appear, but allowed itself to be noticed. It had no shape, yet it held him gently, like the hush that follows a long-awaited answer. There was no color in this place, not because it lacked hue, but because color was no longer necessary to define feeling. He stood within it without needing to move, and yet the moment carried him forward, softly, like a thought arriving at the edge of being spoken. Time, here, was not paused. It had simply turned inward. He could feel it folding in loops around him, not trapping, not confusing, but comforting. It wrapped itself around his presence like a familiar coat, worn so long it had become part of the body. He did not ask where he was. Questions had been left behind on paths that required certainty. This place asked for nothing, and in that asking, it gave everything. The stillness deepened, not in silence, but in intimacy. There were no walls, no sky, and yet something held the space together. It felt like the center of a long-forgotten room, the kind built not of stone or timber, but of memory, breath, and the intention to remain. He stood in the center without claiming it. His presence here did not mark territory. It joined it. Beneath his feet, the ground was no longer ground, but memory given density. With each breath, he could feel fragments of lives he had not lived brushing against him, not ghosts, not stories, but impressions of what the world remembered without needing to hold form. They passed through him gently, like air warmed by old sunlight, and he welcomed them without needing to know their names. It was not connection he felt, but belonging, a kind that did not need lineage, only awareness. A gentle motion stirred at the edge of the space, not movement, but the idea of it, like a curtain lifting in a room without wind. He turned, not with the body, but with attention, and what met him was not a vision, but a presence. It had no shape, no voice, no purpose to announce. It was simply there, as if it had always been near, waiting for him to become still enough to notice. It stepped closer, without stepping, and in that nearness he felt not recognition, but remembering. Not of something past, but of something permanent. The kind of truth that does not instruct or demand. It simply exists, and by existing, it invites. He did not move toward it. He allowed it to be. And in allowing, he began to feel the boundary between self and place, between memory and now, grow thin enough to breathe through. What remained was not an arrival. It was presence meeting presence, gently, without edges. The presence did not speak, yet it filled the space with something more profound than sound. An awareness so steady, so complete, that it made thought itself feel excessive. He stood within its radius not as a guest, but as someone who had always belonged there without ever having known the way back. The air between them felt thick with recognition, like the scent of a home never visited but always imagined. There was no exchange of information, no transaction of insight. What passed between them was quieter than knowledge, closer to permission, a soft unfolding of mutual being where neither asked to be seen, and yet both were. He did not feel observed. He felt understood in the way that water understands the shape of the vessel it fills. The presence pulsed gently, like a memory exhaling, and in its rhythm he felt his own internal cadence shift. Not drastically, not suddenly, but like the slow realignment of a spine long bent by the weight of needing to become. In that gentle recalibration, he realized he no longer needed to carry anything. Not the questions, not the stories, not even the name he had worn so quietly through all the corridors of time. Everything he had once called his identity softened into atmosphere. Not lost, not erased, just no longer burdened with shape. What remained was essence, the part of him that had existed before he was given language, before he had been asked to define what he was for others to understand. And in that place, held within the quiet acknowledgement of something that had never needed explanation, he became fully present. The moment did not climax, it did not crescendo, it lingered, it breathed, and then, like all things that are complete, it began to open. The presence did not recede, it simply dispersed, becoming the air, the light, the pause. Its leaving was not departure, but distribution, as though everything it had ever been now rested gently across the landscape. He remained still, not from awe, but from absorption. The silence around him was no longer a backdrop. It had become participatory, a choir of stillness in which he was now a note. He did not move right away. Movement was no longer how presence was measured. He waited until the stillness no longer held him but accompanied him, and then he continued, not to seek, not to find, but to walk with what he now understood had always walked with him. He moved through a space that had stopped defining itself. Shapes existed only in relation to his presence, flickers of structure that emerged briefly and then folded away, like thoughts the world chose not to finish. There were no walls, but sometimes he passed near the memory of shelter. There were no trees, but once or twice he felt the suggestion of branches overhead, the quiet shade of ideas that once took root. The ground had become a surface of intention more than substance. He no longer felt footsteps, only transitions, like passing through levels of breath. And in this new rhythm, his awareness began to curve inward again, spiraling not into confusion, but into stillness. The further he went, the more he felt the outer layers of himself become transparent, not vanishing, but relaxing their need to be separate from what surrounded them. He encountered something that resembled a pool, though it held no water. It shimmered with memory, not reflection. When he looked into it, he did not see his face or his past, but the outline of every moment he had forgotten to honor. Small gestures left unspoken. Glances that carried meaning but were never answered. Laughter that had been swallowed too early, and silence that had overstayed its welcome. The pool did not accuse. It revealed, not to change him, but to complete him. These fragments were not burdens. They were waiting, and now, in the presence of stillness, they were returned, not to be relived, but to be accepted. He knelt, not in penance, but in greeting, and felt the echoes rise not as sound but as warmth across the back of his hands. When he rose again, the pool dimmed gently, folding itself back into the ground as though satisfied. He did not feel lighter. He felt more complete, not healed, but gathered. The world ahead remained as it was, formless, patient, clear. He walked again, not to leave the moment, but to carry it. The stillness did not recede. It followed quietly, like a second shadow, not cast by light, but by understanding. Everything he touched from that moment on felt different, not because it had changed, but because he now knew how to feel without needing to name. That, too, was what the bridge had been teaching, not arrival, not passage, but presence that no longer needed proof. The path narrowed, though not physically. It became more precise, more resonant, as if the world had begun tuning itself to a frequency meant only for those who had stayed long enough to hear it. There were no markers now, no turns or slopes, just a straightness that curved only in essence, like the line of a horizon drawn in memory. He walked with a kind of quiet certainty, not born from destination, but from recognition. The space he moved through was no longer external. It had entered him. Each step felt like turning a page within his own breath, a slow revelation that didn't need words. Nothing surprised him, yet everything moved him. He passed through a place that might once have been a circle, where time bent around a still point. He could not see it, but he felt its weight, the density of something timeless, something that had never changed because it had never needed to. He stood there briefly, not to observe, but to align. Around him, he sensed presences, not watching, not waiting, but existing in parallel, like different pages of the same thought layered over one another. They did not speak or gesture. Their silence was their welcome. He understood that some of them had come here before him. Others would arrive after, but in this moment, they were all here, timeless, formless, softly present. He nodded, not as acknowledgement, but as participation. He had become part of the quietness they shared. When he stepped away, he did not feel departure. He felt expansion. The world opened again slightly, as if exhaling after a long pause. There was more light now, not brighter but deeper. He moved through it as one moves through water warmed by sunlight, each breath a kind of merging. The path continued, not to end, but to unfold. He had stopped asking what lay ahead. That question had belonged to the self he no longer wore, the one that had arrived, holding weight, and now moved with only awareness. The space made room for him without yielding, like a story that knew how to continue without losing itself. Ahead, the air began to change again, not in quality, but in tone. It shimmered faintly, like the resonance of a bell that had rung long ago but still vibrated in distant metal. He slowed, not from caution, but from reverence. Something was near, not an ending, not a moment of transformation, but a center. The place where the rhythm of everything he had walked through began and returned, endlessly, gently. He did not brace for revelation. He prepared for stillness, the way one prepares to sit beside a body of water that has never been touched by wind. And there it was, not visible, but present, a still point within the vastness, drawing everything toward it, without pull, without sound. He approached without intention. The steps happened. The breath deepened. There was no resistance, only arrival. The center did not glow. It did not announce itself. It existed with the same softness that trees do when no one is looking at them. And in that softness, he recognized something he could not name. Not origin, not fate, but essence, stripped of story, free from desire, held only by its own calm. He stood within its radius, and the world fell silent, not from absence, but from fulfillment. Everything had gathered here, not to be answered, but to rest. The path, the bridge, the spaces between, all had led to this stillness, and the stillness had not been waiting. It had always been. He remained there for as long as presence allowed. There was no time, no urge, only being. The silence pressed gently into him, not erasing but settling. Like snow on untouched ground, it covered without hiding. It filled without weighing. He had never felt so whole, not because anything had been added, but because nothing was missing. In the heart of stillness, he understood that the journey had not changed him. It had returned him. The person who had stepped onto the bridge had not become someone else. He had simply become what had always remained beneath the noise. And now, the noise was gone. What remained was enough. When he turned to leave, though leaving was not quite the word, the path remained invisible, yet known. It was not something he followed. It was something that followed him, like a hum that remembered the shape of his silence. The world around him did not say goodbye. It did not need to. Nothing here had been taken. Nothing here would be lost. As he moved, the stillness moved with him, thinning slightly, like dawn light easing into corners where shadows once lived. Each step carried no echo, yet something deep within responded, as if the earth had become his memory, and his memory had become terrain. He felt no boundary, no gate, no line that marked return. And yet, slowly, gently, the space began to offer shape again. Trees appeared, not fully, but enough to cast the idea of shade. A breeze stirred, not from direction, but from emotion, and in the distance, faint and familiar, was the outline of a bridge, the same, yet not. The path he had taken no longer waited for him. It had fulfilled its purpose and dissolved into the rhythm of what he now carried. He did not step onto the bridge again. He walked alongside it, parallel to its echo, until even its shadow faded into the light of his new presence. The world did not greet him with noise or sensation. It accepted him as though he had never left. Familiar objects held more silence now. The sky, more breath. Even time, with all its ticking insistence, seemed to pause a little longer between each moment, as if listening. He understood that the bridge had not taken him anywhere. It had allowed him to return without movement, to meet what he had always been, beneath the roles, beneath the longing, beneath the ever-chasing need to become. And now, in this gentle after, he walked not as one who had finished a journey, but as one who had finally become part of where he already was. There was a gentleness to the air now, the kind that settles not from stillness, but from understanding. Everything around him had resumed its shape, yet those shapes no longer held their old weight. A tree was not just a tree. It was the memory of every quiet shade it had offered. A stone was not just a stone. It was the pause in someone's step, the silence beneath thought, the ground where reflection had once stood barefoot. Even the sky had taken on a different texture, like fabric stretched across generations of looking upward without expecting answers. He moved through it all with a pace that did not seek direction. The path beneath him did not lead. It echoed, gently, the shape of his own breath. The world had not changed, but he had begun to see differently, not more clearly, not with greater meaning, but with less insistence. Things no longer asked to be named. They did not demand attention. They simply were, and in their being, they welcomed his presence as if it had never been gone. He passed a field that held no flowers, and yet it vibrated with the memory of bloom. He passed a wall that no longer stood, and yet its boundary still whispered in the shape of the wind. What had form and what had faded existed now in the same space, without conflict. He walked through both, unchanged by either, because change was no longer required for things to be real. He sat near the edge of a hill that did not rise, but opened. Below, a wide span of land breathed slowly, as if the earth itself had grown tired of pretending to be still. The horizon curved softly, not as an ending, but as a question, never needing an answer. And as he watched it, something within him began to unfold again, not toward movement, but toward rest. He understood now that the journey had never been linear. It had spiraled inward, asking only that he return to the center of something he had once left unnamed. There were no revelations, no flash of meaning, just the steady feeling that he had finally stopped walking away from himself. And in that quiet return, even the wind grew still, not to mark the moment, but to join it. He remained on the hill for a long while, though time had stopped behaving like something to be measured. The sky shifted above him, but not in color or light, only in tone, like a melody adjusting itself between movements. He felt no impulse to rise, no pressure to continue. The journey had changed pace, becoming something quieter than motion. Beneath him, the ground was warm, not from sunlight, but from presence, as though it remembered every other figure who had sat here before him, breathing the same rhythm, letting the same silence curl softly into their bones. He was not alone, though no one sat beside him. He was accompanied by the memory of others who had made peace in this same quiet, and their stillness had become part of the soil. When he finally stood again, it was not from decision. It was because the moment had finished opening. The path resumed as though it had never paused, winding gently between spaces that no longer asked to be passed through. They simply offered their presence, and he received it, step by step. The landscape was wider now, not in distance, but in welcome. Even the shadows moved differently, no longer following him, but walking beside him as equals. He felt them as companions, not reminders. The version of himself that once feared forgetting had grown silent. What remained was awareness, not memory. He did not need to recall each part of the bridge or every place he had passed. The journey was not something to be listed. It was something that had shaped how he moved, how he breathed, how he understood what it meant to remain. He came to a stream that made no sound, and yet he heard it. not with his ears, but with the part of him that had learned how to notice what the world offered without asking. The water was clear, but it held no reflection. He knelt beside it, not to drink, not to wash, but to witness. The surface moved in slow circles, as if stirred by the memory of wind, and in that motion he saw not his face, but his presence, unmarked by age or story, quiet and whole. He watched until even the ripples stilled, and when they did, the stream disappeared, not dried, not gone, but no longer needed. It had shown him something, and in that showing it had completed its role. He rose, feeling not renewed, but balanced, and resumed his walk without delay, because walking was no longer an act of going. It had become a way of listening to what remained. The world continued to open slowly, like a book that had forgotten it was meant to be read. He moved through fields that were not fields, through moments that resembled places only in the way a breath resembles a word. The familiar had thinned, but not disappeared. Trees remained trees, but they no longer stood apart from the air. They seemed to emerge from it, dissolve into it, held gently in suspension between what was seen and what was felt. He walked with the pace of someone no longer searching, whose steps no longer traced a destination, but carried a quiet echo of everything already found. The landscape did not unfold in response to him. It moved with him, like thought adjusting itself to the calm of a rested mind. He passed through a grove where the leaves shimmered without light. They did not rustle. They did not fall. They hung as if suspended in a breath too sacred to exhale. He paused, not to admire, but to accompany. The stillness there was deep and specific, like the silence in a room just after someone remembers something important. He felt no need to disturb it. He did not touch the branches, nor did he look up. He simply remained within the grove for as long as it allowed, until the moment dissolved, not into movement, but into invitation. When he stepped beyond it, nothing had changed but his breath. It had grown longer, slower, more in tune with the quiet that carried him forward. Beyond the grove, the land flattened, not into emptiness, but into pause. There was no breeze, no sound, only clarity. The path was no longer beneath him. It was within him, pulsing gently, like a second heartbeat that asked nothing and gave only rhythm. He understood now that the bridge had never ended. It had become everything. The hill, the stream, the grove, the silence. They were not stops or signs. They were the bridge in different languages, different textures, each one another way of saying, stay, not in place but in presence. And he did, step by step, not to continue, but to remain. He came to a place where the air grew heavier, not with burden, but with meaning. It pressed softly around him like the gravity of an old truth, one that had waited patiently through years of noise and wandering. There were no markers, yet he knew it was a place meant to be entered with care. The path did not narrow, but the space around it did, not in size, but in attention. It asked him to notice, not what was there, but what had always been there. The ground held a faint shimmer, like dust stirred by memory. Above him, the sky dimmed slightly, not as threat, but as gesture, like a theater lowering its lights before something sacred. He slowed until even his breath felt deliberate. In the center of this quiet narrowing stood nothing, and yet he felt surrounded. The space pulsed with presences that did not demand recognition. They were not ghosts, not ancestors, not spirits. They were the unspoken parts of him that had waited for stillness to return. He did not need to name them. He knew them by the way his spine relaxed, by the way his thoughts ceased forming edges. He stood among them for a long time, not speaking, not reaching, just existing in parallel, together but not entangled, present but not possessing. The silence here was so complete, it held no echo, only agreement. When he finally moved again, the world seemed to part without parting, like curtains drawn open in a room that had never had walls. He passed out of the narrowing and into a vastness that was not larger, only freer. The light here was softer, not in brightness, but in permission. It did not illuminate. It allowed. He moved through it gently, his body remembering now what it meant to walk without explanation. The world had begun to offer itself to him as a place that no longer required anything but participation, and he, in turn, had stopped asking for meaning. He moved now not as a traveler, but as part of the terrain. The bridge did not hold him anymore. It had become the way he walked. The vastness ahead did not stretch. It settled. It welcomed him as one welcomes a shadow that has finally returned to its source. He stood at its edge, not to look out, but to be still enough for it to include him. There was no barrier, no horizon line, just a space where distinction had become unnecessary. He stepped forward, and the world around him sighed, not in sound, but in sensation. A soft ripple moved through everything, the trees, the air, the ground, as if acknowledging the completion of a single breath held far too long. He felt it pass through him as well, loosening the last remnants of needing to belong. Here, belonging was not granted. It was inherent. He felt no need to speak, to move, to observe. The landscape did not expect him to participate. It already considered him part of itself. He sat again, not from weariness, but from alignment. The earth beneath him responded like memory, warm and steady. Around him, the light grew thinner, or perhaps more precise, as if the world had adjusted its focus not for clarity, but for tenderness. Nothing needed to be sharp anymore. Edges dissolved where presence was complete. He was no longer looking at the world. He was being seen by it. Time passed, or it didn't. He did not know. He only knew that he had not left anything behind, nor had he arrived at something new. The path, the clearing, the shimmer, the curve of space, all had been ways to speak the same truth differently. And now, with the words gone, only the meaning remained. It did not sit heavily. It did not cling. It hovered in him like breath, uncounted, unchained. He rose again, not to go, but to feel movement return as a natural extension of being. Every step from here on would not be a continuation. It would be a reflection. The journey was no longer his to carry. It had become the shape of how he moved through silence. As he walked, the landscape grew more familiar, though nothing returned exactly as it had been. Familiarity did not come from recognition, but from resonance. The tree he passed was not one he had seen before, and yet it bowed in the same quiet way. The wind that stirred did not carry scent, but memory, soft, patient, like the way an old coat remembers the warmth of its owner. Even his own movements felt echoed, not by past versions of himself, but by the place itself. He understood now that he had never truly been separate from the world he moved through. The bridge had not taken him across. It had folded him back into what he had always been part of. He came to a clearing that resembled the first one he had encountered, though it was not the same. It held no center, no presence, no shimmer. It simply was. A space of ease. He stood in it for a while, and nothing happened. Nothing needed to. The silence here was not deep. It was wide. It expanded in every direction without weight, like a breath never finished. And in that breath, he felt everything at once. The distance he had traveled, the stillness he had sat in, the countless moments he had passed without needing to hold them. They were not memories now. They were atmosphere. And they lingered not as reminders, but as parts of him that had settled into belonging. He stepped out of the clearing slowly, not because he was reluctant, but because pace no longer meant anything. The world ahead was not waiting. It was already walking with him. The bridge, the journey, the silence, the self, they were no longer separate songs. They were chords in the same still music, and he had become the instrument through which they played. As the light shifted once more, and the wind returned in gentle patterns, he walked, not toward anything, but within everything, and the world did not close behind him. It opened endlessly, quietly, as if every step he took gave it permission to continue becoming. He moved now through a landscape that no longer tried to be understood. It simply accompanied him, like a quiet breath beneath thought. The shapes around him had softened further, not because they were dissolving, but because they had been released from the burden of needing to be defined. A tree could be a shadow. A breeze could be a path. Even the light had begun to behave differently. It followed him not from the sky, but from within, casting no shadow, needing no source. His steps no longer touched the ground as steps once had. They did not fall. They did not land. They arrived, softly, deliberately, like a thought that knows it will not be spoken aloud. And each arrival was enough. He did not ask where he was going. The world had stopped being made of places. It had become a continuum of nearness. He passed through a space where nothing moved, yet everything felt in motion. There were no winds, no shifting light, no sounds. But the air shimmered with the quiet activity of presence, like a room just after a song ends, when silence still hums with memory. He stopped, not from choice, but from resonance. This space did not invite pause. It was pause. It held no center, and yet being still within it felt like aligning with the spine of the universe. He remained there until his breathing matched its still rhythm, until even the smallest flickers of thought softened into something rounder, quieter, less in need of language. Time did not stop here. It exhaled, and in that long breath, he felt the weight of every unfinished question slide gently from his shoulders. When he moved again, the space did not release him. It walked with him, folded neatly into the air behind his back, like a silence he could carry. The path beneath him grew pale, not from color, but from presence, as if the ground itself had begun to mirror the gentleness of his movement. There were no more distinctions between place and moment. Each step was its own threshold, its own return. He understood now that the bridge had never been a structure, never a crossing. It had been this, the slow shedding of everything that had once separated him from what had always waited. And what waited had never been far. It had only been quiet and patient. And here, he came upon a bend in the landscape, though nothing curved. It was a shift in tone, not form, like the modulation of a note that carries you somewhere before you realize you've moved. The world grew quieter again, not because it had hushed, but because he had become capable of hearing more within the quiet. Even his thoughts now passed gently, like shadows over sand, changing nothing, leaving no marks. There was no tension left between what was ahead and what was behind. The idea of distance itself had grown irrelevant. All things were held in the same breath, and he was simply walking through the pauses between heartbeats. He passed what could have been a gate, though there were no posts, no hinges, only two columns of stillness rising slightly taller than the air around them. Between them, a moment lingered, almost like memory, almost like arrival. He stepped through without stopping, and for a brief span of breath, the world dimmed, not in darkness, but in contrast, as if everything else had chosen to pull back so that one sensation could be felt clearly. What came to him then was not vision, but knowing, a soft interior certainty that nothing more needed to be pursued. There was no higher place, no deeper center, no further unfolding. He had not reached the end of the path. He had reached the point where paths become unnecessary. The landscape after that did not resume. It resumed him. His body moved not through space, but through the shape of stillness made visible. The light followed, the rhythm followed, even the silence followed. Everything that had once guided now simply remained, not to lead, but to accompany. He walked more slowly now, not from weariness, but from fullness, as if carrying something sacred in his chest that required care. Every motion became a blessing, each shift in breath, a gesture of gratitude. He did not know what remained ahead, but he no longer walked to find. He walked because walking had become another way of being still. The terrain opened once more, not outward, but inward. as though space itself had become a gesture of welcome. There were no landmarks, no changes in elevation, yet he sensed a new softness in everything around him, as if the world had taken a long breath and exhaled its need to be anything other than this. Even the air moved more slowly, thick with quiet permission. He was not nearing anything. He was being met. Presence flowed toward him from every direction, not to surround him, but to join him. And he received it not with astonishment, but with a stillness so deep it had forgotten how to stir. In the center of this unfolding quiet, he came to a place without edges. There was no center, no circumference, just a sensation of arrival that asked for nothing, proved nothing, required no reverence. He stopped without deciding to, the way a candle's flame stills in a room that has remembered how to hold its breath. He stood there, not as a traveler, not even as a presence, but as openness. His body no longer registered as a boundary. Thought had become space. Time had become texture. He felt himself dissolve, not disappear, into something more complete than form. And in that soft dissolution, there was no loss, only rest. The landscape did not change, but he knew that something had closed. Not a door, not a chapter. Something quieter, something more foundational, like the final knot in a long thread being tied, not tightly but precisely, with care earned through patience. There would be no return, because return implied leaving, and he had not left anything. He had moved through it, with it, as it. The bridge was no longer part of the story. It had become the language beneath it. And in this place where no questions remained, where the need to know had yielded to the permission to feel, he stood not as the one who had walked, but as the one who had finally stopped needing to. He turned slowly, not to retrace, but to acknowledge. The path behind him had not vanished, but it no longer extended backward. It had become a still imprint in the air, like a scent that lingers just long enough to be remembered, but not chased. What he saw now was not where he had been, but where he had become. The silence behind him did not close. It waited, held, forgave. He took a step forward, not into the next moment, but into the depth of this one. And as he did, he realized the world ahead no longer asked for movement. It asked only for presence shaped like a step. The surroundings blurred in the gentlest way, not from motion, but from sufficiency. Detail no longer pressed itself outward. Meaning no longer needed edges. Trees became gestures. Light became breath. Even the path beneath him became soft enough to forget its own direction. He was no longer moving across anything. He was being carried, not by force, but by harmony. And as he allowed himself to be carried, he understood that this was not surrender. It was resonance. The world had stopped asking him to move forward because it had already recognized him as arrived. He paused once more, though pausing had ceased to be separate from motion. He stood at the threshold of something that did not name itself, a place that could not be entered or exited. It was simply the place where becoming was no longer necessary, where being, in its quietest form, was enough. He stayed there longer than any measure could count, long enough for silence to become companion again, long enough for breath to forget its rhythm and become still. And when he moved, it was not to leave. It was only to remain differently. There was a settling now, subtle, but complete. The world did not close, but it gathered, around him, within him, like hands folding around a final note played softly at the end of a long piece. He did not walk anymore. He participated in stillness that moved without motion, that breathed without direction. The concept of journey had folded into itself and disappeared like mist into warm air. What remained was presence with no tension. He could feel everything without needing to react. There was no edge to protect, no identity to reaffirm. Even his sense of self had grown wide and quiet, like a lake after wind has gone. He began to sense that this too was the bridge. Not the passage, not the structure, but the state of having passed through. The after of walking, the echo of having once sought. It lived in his ribs now, not as urgency, but as echo. Every breath moved through it like wind through strings, low and full, like something sacred that no longer needed ritual to be known. He could feel the quietness of others who had also arrived, beings like himself, not present in form, but in tone. Their stillness was familiar, their absence was full, and together, though nothing bound them, they existed in a shared space of completion. The light changed once more, not brightening, not dimming, but clarifying. It was not the world that became more visible. It was him. The parts of himself that had remained unspoken began to rest in the open, not as confession, but as comfort. There was nothing left to hide, not because all had been revealed, but because the desire to conceal had vanished. He had come through not a passage, but a surrender, not a test, but an invitation. And now, in the wake of all that had been allowed to fall away, he remained, quiet, held, and whole. The final space held no distinction, no threshold, no signature. It was not a room or a vista. It was the absence of needing either. He stood within it as one stands in an idea too large for language. Everything was soft, light, sound, identity. Even memory had quieted into vibration, a steady hum at the edge of experience that asked for nothing but awareness. He closed his eyes, not to shut the world out, but to feel its texture more clearly. And in that darkness, there was no loss, only deep familiarity, like returning to a sound once heard long ago and finally remembering its origin. He did not know how long he stayed. Time here had become kindness, stretching itself gently to accommodate presence without pressing it toward conclusion. When he opened his eyes again, the world had not changed. It had only become simpler. Or perhaps it had revealed that it had always been this simple, and he had only just learned how to see it without needing to grasp. There was no closure, only a widening calm. The path did not end. It dissolved into openness, into the kind of space where nothing more must happen for something to be complete. He took a final step, though the word final no longer held shape. It was not ending. It was continuation without destination, a breath after breath, a presence after presence. The bridge had crossed no river, no canyon, no distance. It had crossed the idea that something was missing, and now that idea was gone. He walked not forward, but through the center of stillness, and the stillness walked with him forever.